Hello, everyone. I'm Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we explore the prison that the United States has for many decades on the southern coast of Cuba in Guantanamo. It's a very, very interesting story, and we'll be developing that with someone who's been representing many of the inmates there over a very long time. Before we do, I want to just bring us up to speed on what's been going on over the weekend with the Iranian attack on Israel on Saturday evening, which was a dramatic development in the recent history of the Middle East, marking the first time ever that Iranians have attacked Israel from Iranian soil. And the Israelis are in consultation now as to how they may or may not respond. I wanted to make just a couple remarks that I think are very important for us to hold. The first one, and very importantly, is the Iranians were clear that this was a one-off retaliation for the attack that Israel made about 2 weeks ago on the 1st of April, where they destroyed the Iranian embassy, or consulate rather, in Damascus, and killed a number of Iranian personnel and high-level military personnel. The Iranians asked for a UN Security Council condemnation of Israel. That was blocked by the United States and Britain and France. So over the weekend, the Iranians shot hundreds of drones and various missiles at Israel. Almost all of them were shot down except one or two. But it's important that all the way along with the Iranian attack, the Iranians have been keeping certainly the United States and various Western powers informed, assuring them this was a limited strike and there is no intent beyond simply retribution for the Israeli attack on their consulate several weeks ago. It's very important, I think, for us to bear in mind two things about this. Number one, the one missile that made it through, according to a number of reports, was a hypersonic glide missile that neither Israel nor the United States had any idea that the Iranians even had. And these are the missiles that the Russians have been using in Ukraine. They are also produced by the Chinese. They are extremely fast. They're very mobile. And what was significant about what happened over the weekend is that they were able to penetrate the Iron Dome that Israel has built with U.S. military support to protect Israel. And the point that emerges from this is extremely important, that Iran, now attacking Israel, is doing so not as a pariah state, not as an isolated regime, as has been the case for many, many decades, as the United States and the G7 have sought to isolate Iran, put extraordinary sanctions against Iran. Iran is now able to do what it did to Israel because it is in a direct alliance with both Russia and China. and other countries in the BRICS coalition of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other countries that are in the process of joining. It's very important for all of us to take in that the same coalition now that is confronting the United States and NATO in Ukraine is the same coalition that's now confronting the United States and NATO and Israel in the Middle East. Russia is backed by Iran and China and most of the global South in Ukraine. And Iran is now backed by Russia, China, and most of the global South in the Middle East. So what happened over the weekend, whether or not Israel responds or does something very different, the reality is that we have now moved into a watershed moment where there's a growing global coalition that is actively, politically, and militarily challenging the United States and its G7 NATO allies. And this coalition is very significant with the most sophisticated military out there, certainly rivaling anything that the United States has, as we've seen in Ukraine. What is important, finally, to understand about what happened over the weekend and some of the challenges that are beginning to make themselves felt against the United States and its European and Israeli alliance structure, is that what we're seeing is the culmination of 30 years of neoconservative strategic thinking in the United States. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and David Feith and a number of people in the Pentagon and the State Department issued a white paper that was initially classified, but then made its way around Washington, calling for full spectrum dominance by the United States over the rest of the world, that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the bipolar rivalry collapsed. And there was this unipolar moment that the United States had available to it, during which it decided that the most appropriate thing for it to do, rather than to make peace, was to radically expand its military capacity, push NATO to the east, which resulted in the Ukraine war, continue to militarize Israel, to attack Iraq, Afghanistan, as it subsequently did. And I think the moment in which we find ourselves now is the denouement of this neoconservative strategy on the part of the United States that somehow talked the political leadership in the United States into believing that full spectrum dominance and a highly militarized and aggressive foreign policy formation was going to lead to the domination that they have sought. It has not. And what we're now seeing around the world is this growing coalition that is taking the United States and its allies on now in Europe and in the Middle East in a very coordinated robust, and sophisticated way. Never before, at least since the Second World War, has a situation like this developed. And I raise this today because this is really at the heart of what we're now going to explore around Guantanamo Bay, the prison that the United States has there. Because it was the neoconservatives that took the United States into the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was the neoconservatives that engineered the use of Guantanamo Bay as a prison for people that they had seized without due process or any kind of legal adjudication, and placed in the prison a half a world away. And so we're going to now speak to someone who has been working on those cases and that particular fulcrum point of neoconservative aggressiveness, military and judicial aggressiveness for a very, very, very long time. But what we see in Guantanamo Bay, what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan is not different from what we're seeing now in the Middle East, what we're seeing now in Ukraine, with this extraordinarily coherent and absolutely strategically catastrophic mindset that somehow the United States is capable of exerting such military preponderance around the world that it can ensure full spectrum dominance in perpetuity and maintain its efficacy through military power. That's about ready to collapse. And that is what we want to consider as the context for our discussion today. So I'd like to welcome Bob Rees, who has been on Humanity Rising many times, and he's convened a series of absolutely extraordinary and diverse sessions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob, and you can introduce Brent Rushforth, and then we'll have our conversation as we always do. But thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jim. And again, it's a pleasure, as it always is, to be in this community of great diversity and interest. I have sometimes observed that the great unused gift of the spirit is the imagination, and it's wonderful to see a forum in which there is so much opportunity to explore the intellect and the imagination, the heart and the mind, and finding ways for them to work together for a better world. And I'm delighted today that my longtime friend, Brent Rushforth, is here. Brent and I go back into the 70s when we were neighbors in West Los Angeles. I was teaching at UCLA. Brent was an attorney, and during that time helped start a very important Center for Law in the Public Interest. I was editing a journal at the time called Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, which has been the most influential scholarly journal in the Latter-day Saint Mormon community for the past 60 years. And Brent was my associate editor, and we were really had great fun working together on some important projects, some of them having to do with racial and other issues, and some of them having to do with peace. And Brent and I have both been dedicated to trying to work for peace. And Brent left West Los Angeles, moved to the East Coast, and there began his work as an attorney, and then had this call, which he can talk about, to go to Guantanamo and represent the prisoners there. So I'm just delighted to have Brent tell his story about that experience, which is varied, and because it has the benefit of so many years, it has a depth and a breadth that I think will be wonderful for him to share with you. And then he and I will have some ongoing conversation about that. But mostly, Brent, I turn it over to you, and really are so appreciative of your taking time to share your story with us.
Thank you, Bob. Our lifetime friendship is one of the most important friendships in my life, as it continues to be. Can everybody hear me? I want to make sure that I'm coming through.
Apparently you are.
Okay. Well, if we weren't scared before Jim's introduction about Iran and Israel and the coalition of rogue mafia states that are now aligned against us, speaking for myself, I'm scared now. It's a very, very scary time. And let me state unequivocally at the beginning of this story that from my perspective, having now spent somewhere between 16 and 17 years representing prisoners in Guantanamo, Guantanamo is a disgrace. It is a black mark on the flag of the United States, and history will look back and see it, I believe, as a disgrace. It is certainly a disgrace comparable to the internment of the Japanese United States citizens after Pearl Harbor. And its origin is the same as the origin of the internment of the Japanese United States citizens, and that is fear. When we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, and as I tell my grandkids, I was born about 10 months before Pearl Harbor, and my grandkids look at me like I'm a Neanderthal person. Anyhow, after 9/11, which of course was only the second time the mainland United States had been attacked by an enemy since its founding, everyone was scared. I remember sitting out on the lawn in Washington, D.C. in Farragut Square, near where my law offices were. And I was sitting with one of my law partners, who is one of the most reasonable, level-headed, even-minded guys that I know. And he told me, I'm moving my family to Oregon because Washington, D.C. will be the next target. And that was, I think, the kind of fear that was abroad in the land. And of course, those running the government from George Bush down were focused on defending the United States and retaliating against those who had attacked us. And the search for Osama bin Laden and his colleagues in Al-Qaeda began the day after the attack. Here's what happened in a nutshell. The United States, mostly through the CIA, established black sites around the world, in Bagram, Afghanistan, in Thailand, in Egypt, and in other places around the world, established black sites where so-called terrorists, some of them were indeed terrorists, some of them were not, were taken and tortured. They were tortured by the United States of America in your name and in my name as United States citizens. These men were tortured. And they were tortured because some in the government believed that through torture, they could gain intelligence to find where the bad guys were, including at the top Osama bin Laden. As part of that, the United States started, of course, in December of 2001, started bombing Afghanistan, bombing the mountains, bombing other places in an attempt to wage war against Al Qaeda. And there were several Arab, hundreds, thousands of Arab speakers in Afghanistan who began to flee, most of them across the Pakistan border, began to flee the bombing because Afghanistan had become a very dangerous place to be. The United States threw a net over the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and among other things, offered about a $5,000 reward on a kind of an escalating scale to Pakistan military who captured Arabic speakers coming across the border. And of course, in that part of the world, the average annual income was about $250 in American dollars. So $5,000 is 20 years worth of income. And this was a huge incentive to the Pakistan military to capture and detain Arab speakers coming across the border. And they captured thousands of Arabic speakers coming across the border and put them in prisons in Pakistan, interrogated them, and ultimately the United States decided that the place to put the guys that they deemed bad guys was Guantanamo. Guantanamo Bay is a beautiful, beautiful bay in southeast Cuba, which used to be used for repair of naval ships, United States naval ships. We leased it from Cuba, and the lease is still going on. And for a long time, it was used as a bay where warships would come in and get repaired. But the huge warships of today's Navy are too big and draft too much water to go into Guantanamo Bay. And so that's no longer a warship repair facility. And it was a pretty sleepy place. Not much was going on there. Rumsfeld and others, as Jim calls them, neocons in the Bush administration, came up with the idea that Guantanamo would basically be the place to put the bad guys that they were capturing coming across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. In effect, it was another black site where torture could take place. And torture did take place in Guantanamo. It dwarfed the other black sites. The other black sites, a handful of guys were taken. Guantanamo, initially, there were about 800 Arabic speakers who were imprisoned in Guantanamo. And with the clear intent to place them beyond the reach of United States constitutional law, to place them beyond the reach of any judicial interference with what the military and spy agencies, CIA, wanted to do with these guys. It was beyond the reach. And so lawyers, being nosy and guys who want to, interfere with stuff that they think shouldn't be happening, lawyers started to nose around, and of course, it became evident that there were hundreds of prisoners in Guantanamo, and it was a black site. Nobody knew what was going on. Ultimately, an organization in New York, a public interest organization called the Center for Constitutional Rights, they contacted families of these prisoners in the Mideast, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and other places within the Mideast, and sought permission to seek to represent these guys, and got permission. And ultimately, the United States took the position that these guys had no legal rights under United States law or United States Constitution. We took a case to the United States Supreme Court for a prisoner named Boumediene, and it was argued by a good friend and colleague of mine, Seth Waxman. And as often happens in history, history turns on such tiny threads. Seth Waxman's argument was, in my judgment, probably the most brilliant and powerful argument that I have heard in front of the Supreme Court. And he even had Scalia laughing at one point. And Scalia was a deadly enemy of our position in this case. The long and the short of it is, Boumediene ruled, with Kennedy joining the liberal majority, 5-4, that the prisoners in Guantanamo had habeas corpus rights, not due process rights, not anything further than habeas corpus rights. And habeas corpus is a concept of British law that basically came into existence in the 12th century with King Arthur, and basically it is a concept that if you're arrested by the king, you can hold up your hand and say, you've got the wrong guy, and force the king and his government to present evidence to a court that they've got the right guy. So that's what habeas corpus means. And we got this 5-4 ruling in Boumediene that Guantanamo prisoners had habeas corpus rights. So that's when I started, with others, commuting to Guantanamo. I received authorization from 6 families of Guantanamo prisoners to represent their boys in Guantanamo, and started flying to Guantanamo. Over the last, I think my first trip to Guantanamo was at the beginning of, or middle of 2005. And my last trip was in 2021. I haven't been there for a couple of years. So about 16 or 17 years, I commuted to Guantanamo. I flew to Guantanamo around 50 times. And the first 3 or 4 years of that commute were pretty dangerous, because they put us in they put us in a bucket of bolts to fly out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And this little tiny airplane didn't have a bathroom. Its engines seemed to be falling off, and we were really whipped around in some bad storms flying into Guantanamo. So the real danger we faced was in that airplane, not in being on the base in Guantanamo. But let me just now tell you, and Bob, you interrupt me anytime I'm going far afield here, but when I first went into a prison cell in Guantanamo, I met with my first client. His name was Allah. He was 19 years old, and he was accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda and attacking the United States in various ways. The evidence against him proved not to be substantial, but as I sat down across from Allah, he was really a very good-looking, attractive young man. And in fact, he was known among his fellow prisoners as the Kid, because he was young, very attractive, and very, he was kind of a humble young man. And so I sat down across the table from him, introduced myself. And the first thing he told me is that the CIA guys had been in the day before I got there. And they told Allah that I was Jewish, that I was gay, and that I was a CIA agent. And I laughed, and then I looked at Alla and said, well, as Jerry Seinfeld would say, not that there's anything wrong with that. but it turns out I'm none of the above. And he said, well, how am I supposed to know that? And I said, well, just listen to me for a few minutes, then you make the call. You tell me what you believe, because it's up to you. But I told him that my only responsibility under United States law was to him, and not to the United States, not to anybody else in the world, but to him. He was my client, and that I would do everything in my power to represent him forcefully, and if possible, to get him out of Guantanamo. Well, it didn't take very long. He decided that I was telling him the truth, not the CIA guys, and his trust in me never, ever wavered for a moment from that time on. And we developed a very strong attorney-client relationship. Anyhow, I represented Alla. He was my first before a judge in the United States Federal District Court in Washington. That's where these habeas cases were brought, before a judge named Gladys Kessler. And Gladys Kessler, I can only say, is in the very, very finest tradition of United States judicial system and jurisprudence. She was polite to both sides, the United States and to me and my client, and she heard all the evidence, and she made a ruling. This, I think, may have been the first habeas ruling. She made a ruling. The United States had relied on some evidence which was adduced through torture of Alla. And the United States took the position, well, that was really a couple of years before Alla told us the stuff that he told us. And so it really doesn't count. You know, it was 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, and it was old news, you know. And Gladys Kessler, in her 45-page opinion, ordering the government to send Alla home from Guantanamo because they had no evidence against him that he was adverse to the United States, addressed their torture argument. And I will never forget the powerful sentence in the middle of her opinion. It said, "Once tortured, always afraid." Once tortured, always afraid. So she ordered Alla to be sent home, released from Guantanamo and sent home. And to show you how thick-headed the government was at that point, they failed to take an appeal of that decision. There was 30 days to appeal. I still don't know why they failed to appeal. But on the 31st day, I called them. I called the Justice Department and said, okay, boys, when are you sending Alla home? The appeal has run. Judge Kessler has ordered him home. When are you sending him home? He said, oh, can we have a meeting? So we went to the State Department, the State Department had some secret rooms in that vast complex of office buildings. And we met in a secret room in the State Department. And there were about 15 people from the government there, including every single government agency. The CIA, the NSA, the Defense Department, Navy, Army, Air Force, everybody was there aligned, talking to. And the Justice Department spokesman basically told me that they were not going to send Alla home. And I was shocked, but I was listening. And I said, well, just tell me what your position is. And they basically said, we're not going to send him home because it's too expensive to just take one prisoner home. We have to wait until others are released so we can put several of them on the same airplane, because the airplane has to be accompanied by a fighter jet, and on and on. And I kind of listened to this for 45 minutes or so, and then I said, guys, when was the last time you read Article 3 of the Constitution? Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the judiciary, and it's an independent judiciary which says what the law is and has the power to order the executive branch to obey the law. And I said, guys, when did you last read Article 3? And then I said, Judge Kessler's order is final. And you guys, I said, I'm not trying to be, rude or nasty, but here's your choice. Tell me tomorrow the arrangements that you have made to get Alla home, released from Guantanamo and home, or I'll see you back in front of Judge Kessler. Well, he called me the next day and said, we're not sending him home. So to make a long story short, I took them back in front of Judge Kessler, and I'm not sure that I have ever in my 50 years or 52 or 3 years of trying cases have ever seen a judge that angry. She basically told the government, I'll give you 10 days to have him on an airplane, and when you come back into my courtroom, you had either better have him on an airplane or tell me the arrangements that are being made to put him on an airplane, or bring your toothbrushes. I mean, she was very, very, very angry. And I tell this story, perhaps in too great detail, simply to say, that's our system of government. The Article 3 creates a judiciary which is independent and has the power granted by that article of the Constitution to order the executive branch to obey the law. That's our system of government, and it was that system, system of constitutional government, that the executive branch was thumbing its nose at by the creation of and maintenance of a secret dark prison in Guantanamo. And Judge Kessler may have been the first, I'm not sure. She may have been the first to demonstrate the power of the federal judiciary over the executive branch regarding Guantanamo. And that was the beginning of successful representation of prisoners in Guantanamo. Of the 700 to 800 prisoners which were originally moved to Guantanamo, Donald Rumsfeld and the Bush administration released about 500 of them because they realized pretty quickly that their net had caught up a bunch of guys against whom they had virtually no evidence that they'd ever been adverse to the United States. So they released them, sent them home, 500 prisoners. But they kept about 200, and not with any greater amount of evidence that these were necessarily the worst of the worst, but just because they kept them. Now, some of them are still there. There are about 20 of them that are still there. But over time, habeas corpus litigation of my colleagues and myself released many of those prisoners. Now, a couple of interesting things.
Brent,
Yes.
before you go on, it just seemed to me if you could say a word about the ridiculousness of the government's argument that it couldn't afford to send one prisoner home when it was spending between $11 and $13 million a year per prisoner.
Per prisoner, per prisoner. We have spent literally billions and billions of dollars on Guantanamo, maintaining the prisoners there. Well, Judge Kessler, to say the very least, had no patience with that argument whatsoever. In fact, it set her off. I don't, as I say, I'm not sure I've ever seen a federal district court judge quite as angry as she was that morning. And she made no bones about the fact that she expected her order to be complied with. And ultimately it was. here are a couple things before I go on. Regarding torture, the CIA was the torturer in chief of the United States government. The Army intelligence guys would not torture. They would not do it. And they wouldn't do, and nor would the FBI. The FBI was involved too, as was Army intelligence. And they would tell us, we won't participate in this torture program. And the basic reason was twofold, but the first reason was by far the more important. It doesn't work. It doesn't work, because if you torture a guy, he'll tell you anything that he thinks you want to hear to get out from under the torture. And you know, be assured that waterboarding is torture. Waterboarding kind of sounds like benign, because all you do is put a cloth over a guy's nose and mouth and pour water into it while he's slanted backwards. But it actually induces the fear of drowning and the gag complex, and nobody can survive it. Nobody. If you're waterboarded, there will come a time when you'll break because you feel an inexorable feeling of drowning. So, but waterboarding wasn't all they did. I mean, there was physical abuse, there was sexual abuse, and these are many of these prisoners were devout Muslims who reacted poorly to sexual abuse. But neither the Army intelligence guys, nor for that matter, the naval intelligence guys, nor the FBI would torture. Some of you may have seen the movie Zero Dark 30, which is the story of the story of the killing of Osama bin Laden by SEAL Team 6. One of the key moments in that story, which is a pretty good film, pretty exciting film, the footage of SEAL Team 6 going into Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden. It was a pretty compelling movie. But in the middle of it, there's a key moment where that reflected that they had found the intelligence regarding this courier that was taking messages to Osama bin Laden in his compound, that the guy who told them about this courier, whom they then followed to the compound, and that's how they found out where Osama bin Laden was, that he gave up his information because he was tortured. That is not correct. He didn't give up his information because he was tortured. He gave up his information because the Army intelligence guys had established a relationship with him, and he started talking to them. And ultimately, he talked all the way to the end of his story, and he told them about this courier, which they then followed to Osama bin Laden's compound. Let me just say, to emphasize the point, Guantanamo was created as a black site to keep these guys from any reach of the United States judicial system, and the United States Constitution. Now, once habeas corpus had been established for these guys, a very, very smart general named General Martin, who was a lawyer, educated at Harvard Law School, created the military commission rules and established the military commission in Guantanamo to try these guys for war crimes. Not, I think with one exception, not a single Guantanamo prisoner has been tried to a conclusion by the military commission system. And the primary reason is any evidence that was to be presented before the court and the jury made up of military officers, United States military officers, was adduced through torture, and thus unreliable and not admissible. And that's one of the biggest reasons why nobody has been tried to a conclusion, I think with one exception, a guy from Australia. So there are still about 20 guys there, seven or eight or nine of whom are so-called high value detainees, HVDs. And they are the guys that the United States thinks are bad guys, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who has been waterboarded over 180 times. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is, from our perspective, has culpability because he helped to plan 9/11. So over the course of 16 or 17 years, I was able to get 6 guys home through litigation before the federal district court in Washington and through negotiation with the Obama administration. Prior to litigation, I was able to get 6 guys home. I do continue to represent a 7th guy who is a high value detainee, and he's terribly crippled by a back injury. And he is still in Guantanamo, but we have negotiated his release, and we're looking to get him a place to land in Oman or somewhere in the Mideast. The current status of Guantanamo is, it could have been closed years ago. It hasn't been closed. It's being maintained at the cost of billions of dollars a year, and there is no end in sight. I'm not sure that the United States has learned the lessons that I would hope and think that they should learn from the Guantanamo experience, because I believe almost any fair-minded person, strike that, I'm not sure who would agree with what I'm about to say, but Guantanamo hasn't made the United States any safer than it was at the time of 9/11. I think there can be a pretty strong argument made that, if anything, Guantanamo has made the United States less safe, because once you say to the world that we're willing to abandon our principles and torture Muslims and throw away any constitutional principles or any notion of the laws of war, international laws of war, I think it hasn't made us safer. It has probably made us more vulnerable. I made an argument before the judge and in the military commissions a couple of years ago. My client, who was crippled by his back injury, was sitting maybe 5 feet to my left, and I was arguing to a judge who was an Air Force officer. And what I said to him is, I'm not sure Franz Kafka could have concocted a system that is any crazier and any more irrational than the system we're engaged in here. And my point to the judge was this: you're sitting there on your bench representing the United States, and my client is sitting here to my left. And here's what you're telling my client. He's going to go through this trial according to the rules of the military commissions structured by General Martin. And, it's going to take weeks. The evidence will be adduced, arguments will be made, and he'll either be found innocent or guilty by a jury made up of officers of the United States military. And, they'll find him either innocent or guilty. But then you're saying to him, Judge, representing the United States, it doesn't matter whether you're found innocent or guilty. We're going to keep you here forever anyway, because you're an enemy combatant. And under our reading of international law, we can keep you here forever, beyond the reach of our judiciary. Because even though they had habeas, the only way to reach into the heart of that argument is through habeas corpus litigation. But imagine you're sitting there as my client, and the United States is telling him, we're going to put you through this trial, and you've got a good attorney, maybe you'll get off, maybe the jury will find you guilty, doesn't matter, we're going to keep you here forever anyway. So that's
Brent, I've heard the term used, forever prison, in relation to Guantanamo.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the challenges is that there was no leader of this that the United States could go after. There was no identified single person, as we often do, as for example with Osama bin Laden. Get him, you kind of get, at least symbolically, you get somebody at the top, and there was nobody at the top of Al Qaeda that could have been prosecuted. Is that correct?
Well, I think the primary reason is frankly that the United States believed that these guys were ultimately beyond the reach, but for habeas corpus litigation of the United States constitutional system. So, they could designate them enemy combatants and simply hold them there, whether or not they were convicted under the military commission system. And yes, it's a forever prison, it may well be, because in spite of his the wishes that he expressed, Obama didn't close it. He had a couple of opportunities to move in that direction, but he apparently had expended what he considered to be all of his political capital on the Affordable Care Act and other stuff. So he really didn't push the closing of Guantanamo. Trump, of course, had no interest in closing it. To the contrary, and Biden hasn't been able to close it. And it's become, I think it's fair to say, a somewhat forgotten prison as well as a forever prison. It's certainly not in the headlines. By far, if anyone is interested in learning, more of the details about what has gone on in Guantanamo, by far the best and most accurate and persistent reporter of Guantanamo is Carol Rosenberg. She wrote for many, many years for the Miami Herald, and then moved to the New York Times, and she's still reporting on Guantanamo. I read Carol's latest article a couple of weeks ago, and frankly, whenever even though I was commuting to Guantanamo and spent years down there with the prisoners, I'd read Carol Rosenberg to find out stuff that was going on. She was really tenacious and an excellent reporter.
Brent, I'm really interested, just to pause for a minute in time. This was not your job. You were in a law firm doing other things. What is it that motivated you as just a citizen to devote so much of your time and energy and resources to representing these people that the world had kind of forgotten? I'm just really interested in you're saying something about what it was that, as you were reading about this, decided, I've got to do something.
Well, I'll try to answer that, Bob, but let me say right off the top, answering that question, which I've tried to do in a few settings, has led me to some people to say I'm bragging about myself and I'm immodest.
I know you well enough to know you aren't.
And so I always have wanted to try to be careful. I'll tell you a story. One of my smart prisoners, I mean, really a smart guy, named, of course, Mohammed, as several members of the prison camp were. I'd been representing him for 5 years or so. He was so smart. He was kind of a leader and an educator, and he was very deeply devoted to Islam and to his religion. And in fact, I had a couple of long conversations with him about religion, telling him about Mormonism, and he told me about Islam, and we became very good friends. He's home. He's was released. I asked him that question, and again, please forgive that this may sound immodest, but I asked him. I said, Mohammed, why do you think I'm sitting here across from you? Why do you think I've spent all these years trying to help you? And he paused and he kind of leaned back, and he looked at me and he said, there are really two reasons, Brent. He said the first is you're a humanitarian. You've got a big heart and you want to help people who are being abused. So I told you this was going to sound immodest, but this was Mohammed's response. He said the second reason, related to the first, is you wanted us, and insofar as we talked to other Muslims, and you wanted us to believe the very best about America.
Yeah. But I don't take that, knowing you, as anything self-congratulating or anything else. I think it is what motivates you, and I think it is the best of what this country has, that an ordinary citizen, as you were, sees something that seems morally indefensible and wrong, and tries with whatever resources he has to do something about it. And that seems to me to be the thing that gives us most hope about the future of this country, is that there are people who care enough about it to sacrifice whatever they have to try and to make things right. I think of when I took a group of writers to China in the 80s, one of the writers I was going to take was Caroline Forche, a wonderful poet. And I remember very much one of the lines from her poem out of her collection of poems called Salvador. It's a poem called The Visitor, about a man who's in prison. And in his dreams, he feels, as he's in the prison each night, he feels his wife's breath that visits him. And the poem closes with this line: there's nothing that one man will not do to another. And it seems to me that Guantanamo is that, but that there was something in you that felt, when you see this kind of injustice, it motivates you to do something. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to invite you to be on this program, because I think we're at a time when America and the world needs people who have a moral center, whose humanity is arrested, as it were, by things that they see and the motivation to do something about them. Tell us just one story about one of these people and their families, and what it might have been like for their families to have a loved one in this place, and to feel, after all of the effort, that they never were getting out.
Well, Bob, first let me comment on all the kind words you just uttered about me. It reflects that you and I have been friends for 50 years. There are a lot of people who think otherwise about me. So I appreciate your kind words, but I know it's because you and I have loved each other as friends for a long, long time. I will say that what Mohammed said to me kind of choked me up in the moment. And when I recovered myself, I said, "Well, Mohammed, you got that exactly right." But as I say, I'm not. I don't feel very comfortable. When I told that story to one of my law partners, he said, "Brent, don't tell that story very broadly because it makes you look like you're, consider yourself a great humanitarian." Okay, so here's a story. It wasn't all just really heavy duty constitutional law and torture and so on. There were some comic moments, and here's one, and it responds to your question about just a particular family that had one of the guys sitting in prison there. His name was Fadl Hentif. And the primary evidence against Fadl Hentif when he came across the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan was that he was wearing a Casio watch on his left wrist, a Casio watch. And bombers from Al Qaeda often used Casio watches to set off their IEDs. I wanted to say IUD, but that's abortion. To set off their IED. So Fadl had a Casio watch, and that was their primary evidence against him. And when I pointed out to them that hundreds of thousands of Middle Eastern men had Casio watches, it didn't persuade them. So that was the primary evidence against Fadl Hentif. He was a sweet guy, and he had gone. His father died. He was a Yemeni. His father had died and left him a little bit of money. And he, Islam, contrary to huge popular belief in America and other places, Islam has a very, very, very deep tradition of charity. And so Fadl took his little bit of money and bought a taxi cab. And he was a taxi cab driver in Yemen. But then he decided to follow his charitable instincts. He sold his taxi cab, went to Kabul, Afghanistan, and became an ambulance driver. And he considered this his charitable response to his duties as a Muslim. And when the United States started bombing Afghanistan, he took off, and he was because it was really a dangerous place to be, and so he got caught on the border of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and ultimately ended up in Guantanamo, and I represented it. Well, I flew to Yemen. I can't remember, 2009, 2010, 2011, 5 years into my representation of these guys. I flew to Yemen. I think we had been in South Africa with my family, and I stopped in Yemen, if you could call it that, because it felt like I was flying around the world to get there. But I went to Yemen and met with two of the families. Those were the only two I could really make contact with. But one of them was Fadl Hentif's cousin, his first cousin, not his brother, but his first cousin. And his name was Allah. And he picked me up. When you fly into Yemen, even in those days, before Yemen became a completely failed state, even in those days, you'd fly into Yemen and the airport had F-16s all over the runway. And when you drove into downtown Sana'a, which is the capital, Sana'a is a gorgeous old city. It's 7,000 feet up in the mountains, 2,000 feet higher than Denver. And it's in a very arid landscape, arid mountains, but it's gorgeous. And so I'll tell you two stories just to, Allah, who was Fadl Hentif's cousin. Now, even before Yemen fell apart, over the last few years, it was a very, very tribal country. That it was peopled by family tribes located in various geographic locations around the country. And these tribes were often heavily armed and, prepared to defend themselves against all comers. Well, that was the kind of family Fadl Hentif was from. It was about 75 miles. Let me get my geography right. 75 miles northeast of Sana'a. And so Allah had come into Sana'a to meet me, his family. And so we spent about 2 or 3 days going around Sana'a in his red pickup truck. And he would not let me purchase anything. He treated me to wonderful dinners. He even, when I stopped next to, we stopped in the souk, which, by the way, Sana'a, and more particularly Aden, Aden, on the Red Sea, is generally, in Yemen, is generally considered the second oldest city in the world, second only to Damascus or Baghdad, one or the other. Aden is supposedly the second oldest city. Anyway, so Allah is taking me all around Yemen, all around Sana'a. The fish in Sana'a is just outstanding. Their food was, anyway. We stopped in the souk, which is about 4,000 years old, and it's just vegetables, fruits, coffee beans, every kind of stuff in this souk, and it's just a completely beautiful bazaar. And Allah went into this trinket shop. He wouldn't let me buy trinkets for my daughters and my wife. He was going to buy them, and he was buying these little $5 trinkets for me, and I was standing there watching. Next door, there was a camel pulling around it must have been a 3 or 4 ton stone. He was walking in a circle, pulling this stone around in a circle, grinding sesame seeds into sesame oil. And I watched him for 2 or 3 minutes, and I turned to Allah and said, Allah, this must have been going on here for 4,000 years. And Allah looked into this watched this camel, and he turned to me and said, yep, different camel. So it was not, he had a great sense of humor. After the 2 or 3 days we'd spent together, we pulled up in front of my hotel, right up in the top of Sana'a. It was a brand new hotel built by the Swiss. And that's where I was staying. And he turned off his ignition, and we sat there in his little red Toyota pickup. And he said, Brent, in broken English, he said, I have to tell you, before I come to Sana'a, my family sat in council. And the question was whether I kidnap you and bring you back to our family compound and hold you there until such time as Fadl Hentif is released from Guantanamo. And as I found out later, kidnapping antagonists is an age-old strategy of these highly armed families in Yemen, probably elsewhere too, but certainly it goes on in Yemen. So all I could do is I listened to this, and I turned to him and said, thank you for not kidnapping me. So I escaped. I escaped the kidnap. Let me say that we were the so-called Guantanamo Bar Association. We called ourselves that for humor's sake. And there were probably 60 or 70 lawyers that were down there during the time I was there. And we were pretty successful in the district court in habeas corpus litigation, but the DC Circuit overturned many of those habeas releases for the flimsiest of reasons, because for one reason or another, we kept getting very kind of neocon panels on the DC circuit, and so we had several of those cases overturned. But Obama appointed an ambassador status to negotiate with us on prisoner release, and we were able to get several prisoners released through negotiation with the Obama administration.
So, Brent, we're
yes.
What I'd like to do is just kind of wind this up and turn this over to Jim. Is there something that you might want to say, and we're going to have an opportunity in the after chat to to continue the discussion. But before Jim comes back in, is there anything you'd like to say, just kind of as a closing from your? This seems to me this very rich and valuable experience, and for me, it seems both an example and a model of citizenship to for you to have done what you've done and to share your story. Is there anything you'd just like to say in closing about kind of what you've learned and where we are in relation to Guantanamo, and then let him and share whatever he wishes to share with us?
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. It's a story that I have to say is as I look back on my legal career, I see as one of the most important things I was able to be involved in. And I'm very, very glad that I will say this, my law firm couldn't have been better about supporting me. I mean, I was a high-paid trial lawyer litigating antitrust cases and other kind of stuff, but I was spending a lot of time in Guantanamo on my law firm's dime, and there was never, and I was all, of course, pro bono. These prisoners didn't have two nickels to rub together, nor would we have considered asking them to pay us. But there was never so much as a hint of criticism from my law partners about my involvement there, which frankly they were paying for, and I was very proud of that. But I'll just say two things in response to your question that surprised me. The first thing that surprised me was the capacity for human connection with these guys who many in the United States still call the worst of the worst, terrorists, killers. I will tell a very brief story, just because it's so interesting. I have a little house up on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, and we go to church up there, the Mormon chapel at Wolfboro. And on one Sunday after the service, I was walking down one of the hallways, and one of my co-religionists, a young woman, friend of mine, stopped me and told me how proud she was of the work I was doing in Guantanamo. I thanked her. But at the very same moment, another member of her family on the other side of had accosted my daughter-in-law and told her, "Your father-in-law is releasing terrorist killers, and they're all going to come after us and kill us." So there you had, at literally the very same moment, two opinions on the same subject. That having been said, I'll just respond quickly. I learned two things, I think, that surprised me. I'm not sure they should have surprised me, but one was the capacity for human connection with these guys that everybody had called the worst of the worst and terrorists. There was just a very strong, now, of course, I was trying to get them out of prison, so they had good reason to I think, like me and appreciate me. But there was a very strong personal bond with several of them. Not all of them. There was one guy who was really angry and never got over his anger. But the human bond, the human relationship between people who, on the surface, had so very little in common. I was a privileged citizen of the United States. These were tortured, tortured men who everyone thought of as terrorists, and of completely different background and religion and so on. But there was a very, very, very strong human connection. The second thing on the other side of the spectrum that surprised me, frankly, was the capacity for arrogance and stupidity on behalf of the United States. I mean, almost breathtaking at times. I was arguing a case in court, actually, for Fadl Hentef that I talked about. And I had the government dead to rights because I had a memo from his interrogation in one of the black sites. And somebody had made a memo, and I presented it to the court. There were two CIA guys sitting in the back of the court, and their attorney asked the court for a continuance until the following day. And the court granted it. He was a good judge. He granted their continuance. The next day, they came back in, and I can't prove what I'm about to say, but I know it's true. They had gone back across the river to Langley and had manufactured a new version of the memo and had brought it back in, whitewashed the bad stuff, and had brought it back into court the next day. And I couldn't prove what they had done. They said they found it, but I know that wasn't true. They manufactured it, and so it was, the arrogance was sometimes breathtaking, and as I say, unfortunately, I don't think the creation and maintenance of Guantanamo ever made the United States safer in the world.
Thank you so much. And Jim, please come in and share your perspective.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Brent. What a fascinating story. The first point I wanted to make is just to underscore that, your proximity to Guantanamo really brings into close relief the best and the worst of America.
Well,
that you know what the worst is, keeping people, torturing people, brutalizing people over decades in some cases without any due process. That's the worst of America. But then also you represented the best of America, that in a free country, a law firm would allow one of its lawyers to represent the downtrodden and the vulnerable, pro bono, in a highly controversial domain. That's the best, so that juxtaposition of sort of the light and dark dimensions, I just wanted to underscore that, because you've lived that. And
well, Jim, I appreciate it. As I say, it's always dangerous to tell this story because it can certainly, with a little twist of the dial, sound like braggadocio. But but I will say that since I was a kid, I guess there's been something in me that reacts poorly to mistreatment of downtrodden.
Yeah. And I think that is not only best of America, that's the best of humanity. But it's also rare in our world, even today. If you look around the world, not very many countries would allow people to do what you have been doing. And we should just, as U.S. citizens, honor that aspect of the republic of which we're a part. So I just want
I will say this, and I always say one thing too many, probably, but the guys that I represented, I think, came away from that experience with absolutely no question whatsoever that there were good things about America.
Yeah.
That America was not the great Satan. Once they had experienced this helping hand, they recognized it for what it was.
Yeah.
And they saw it as something good in America.
Let me drill down on this issue of torture, because that's sort of embodied with, the American war in Iraq, with the prison in Abu Ghraib and the photographs of dehumanization that came out of that. It was infused in Guantanamo. And I'd like to just ask a couple of things, and then you can just answer. I mean, one is, it is so extraordinary that torture doesn't elicit the very information that you seek, that it distorts the information that you seek. And so that's one side of it. But what I'd love to hear from you, in terms of your interaction with presumably many of the men that you represented that were in fact tortured in black sites and so forth. What was as you observed it, what was the effect of their experience on their own personalities? Now, you mentioned that one of the men was just persistently very angry about everything. But did the experience that these men, the experience that they underwent, how did you observe it affecting their personalities and their character?
Well, differently. The fellow that I told you about, who maintained a very high level of anger all through my representation of him, never once softening his true rage against the United States and against what had happened to me, was the fellow that had been tortured the worst. He had been quite severely tortured. I was in the room when he told his story with my partner and a young woman associate, and all of us were close to tears. She had to leave the room, and so someone asked me whether I believed his story. The answer was yes, I believed his story, and it had filled him with rage, and it had, that rage, as far as I could tell, was never let up. And in fact, these guys were all shackled to the floor when we met with them in their cell, in the interview cells. By the way, we knew that we were being recorded, totally contrary to attorney-client privilege rules. And sure enough, we were recorded. We found that out later. And the brigadier general who was in charge of the defense of these guys actually got thrown in the brig because he threw a fit when he learned that, definitively that we were all being recorded. He was a defense counsel, a brigadier general who was a defense counsel. Terrific guy. And so that's one way in which one of my prisoners reacted. It filled him with rage, and as far as I know, he's home now. Wherever he is, I've lost contact with him, but I'm sure he's still filled with rage. And here's about him. Here's the true story about him. He was basically a Muslim warrior. He had grown up in Saudi Arabia. He had gone to Afghanistan, but for a long time he had fought on the side of the United States against the Russians. And in fact, he was carrying a weapon provided to him by the United States against the Russians. And then when the world flipped on its head, he was still a Muslim warrior, but then he was fighting against the United States when they invaded Afghanistan. That's what he was. He was a soldier, and he was severely tortured. Only half of my guys told me stories of torture. I don't know whether the other three were tortured or not. I rather doubt it, because they never told me about it. The other the other two, you know, seem to have weathered it better than my severely tortured client did. And as I say, Allah was tortured, and then the government said, "Yeah, but we tortured him a long time ago," and then he gave up the information later on. And Judge Kessler said, "No, I'm not buying it. Once tortured, always afraid." Allah was always afraid that if he said boo, he was going to get tortured again. So different. It affected each of them differently.
And then just finally, Brent, and thank you for all this. Insofar as you know, is torture and, you know, rendition sites and black sites, do they continue to be operated by the CIA and in third party countries to the present day? Or was that something that, you know, that was really a function of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and, you know, the Bush administration, the Bush Jr. administration, when the neocons were really at their apogee moment? What's your understanding of the situation today around all that?
I cannot speak to the world at large. I can speak to Guantanamo. We shut it. When the lawyers went in on habeas corpus, shut it down completely. There was no more torture going on in Guantanamo because they knew that they couldn't get away with it. I mean, it was then an open book. So it stopped in Guantanamo. I have no doubt about that. Whether it's still going on in Thailand or Bagram, Afghanistan, or Egypt, I don't know. I kind of think they've probably pulled back, but you know, if certain regimes come to power again in the United States, who knows what will happen? I mean, we may go into a deep, dark, black pit again. But as far as I know, I know it stopped in Guantanamo, and as far as I know, it has stopped around the world. That one of the problems is Jean Haspel, who became the head of the CIA, was in charge of a black site. I mean, she was literally running a black site. I believe it was the black site in Thailand. So, you know, the only place I know the door got slammed on it was Guantanamo, and it got slammed because the lawyers kind of opened the book down there. They couldn't do it anymore.
Well, thank you for that heroism, really, and that embodiment of the constitutional regime that every country should be governed by. And as we see, even in the United States, with one of the most refined democracies, certainly in modern times, we can lose our way very, very quickly. And
yes.
It takes people like you and others to keep reminding us of our higher self.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll make one funny comment. I was sitting on a shuttle from Washington to New York years ago, and I was sitting up in the front of the plane, and who should sit down next to me but Paul Wolfowitz? And I turned to him, and of course I recognized him. And I turned to him, and I just couldn't resist myself. I said, Paul, way to go in Iraq. Good job. He didn't appreciate it.
Well, Brent, Bob, thank you all both so much for this. It's really inspiring what is possible when a single individual and a group of individuals really take on social justice, ethical principles in the way that you have. It's a badly needed model in our very, very chaotic world. So thank you.
Jim, I was going to say, I often turn to poetry as a way to make sense of the world. And as I was reading last night, I found this poem by Katie Ford. It's called the Throats of Guantanamo. There were three prisoners, and one of them young, who apparently, from what the government said, had somehow bound themselves, their feet and their hands, and stuffed rags in their mouths, and then somehow climbed up on a thing and hung themselves. And Katie, hearing about this in an article or on a news report on Harper's, says this. She's sitting on a morning in her own room. She's stitching a quilt. And she says, "Nothing opens with the comforts of my unbeaten body. A tinker stack of quiltings, the cloth finch half attached to a mobile of warblers and wrens." So she has this beautiful image of birds freely flying in the world. In the meantime, my country sends posts to mothers and fathers. Back again fly a trinity of boys with their throats torn out, these three prisoners. Simultaneously drinks twig tea and stitches a hidden seam. She's still stitching her thing. And she says, "I take a string of a bittern's and tie it to the looping newborn delight and read of each strangulation, no bone or larynx for proof. Maybe each heart was tossed to the bay." A medieval saint was asked, "What would you do if you knew it was the end of the world?" "I'd dig in my garden," he said. "Oh, saint," the poet says, "it's a good answer, but here the end is torn out one by one. The torture of those young men and the torture of all of those that we claimed were suicides but were murders. It's just again to think about the end of the world and what the end of the moral world that this represented. So a kind of sad, tragic note from a poet, but just for any of us hearing what was going there is heartbreaking, and doing the kind of stitching of everyday thing, which I think Brent's beautiful work represents, is what gives us hope.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Brent. And in fact, tomorrow we're going to have a whole session on sound healing. I thought that after a session on Guantanamo, we should just expansively listen to some sound and explore sound healing. So that'll be tomorrow on Humanity Rising. Right. So that'll do it for us for today, everyone. You'll see the link in the after chat if you want to join Brent and Bob for a few minutes for further discussion. You receive the link in your Zoom reminder for today, and then we'll see you all again here tomorrow on Humanity.